It's Tuesday, the 4th of October. This is Politics Live from the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. With me here in Birmingham, The Guardian's political editor, Pippa Crerar, Associate Editor of The Telegraph, Camilla Tominey, and Cabinet Office Minister Brendan Clarke-Smith. Today,
it's those on lowest earnings who are being hurt the most by the cost of living challenges that we face, so it's morally right for the government to do so.
Liz Truss dons a hard hat as more trouble brews here in Birmingham after she refused to commit to increasing benefits by inflation.
No decision has been made yet on that issue, and I look forward to having those discussions.
The ladies not for turning.
But the current Prime Minister defends her U-turn on scrapping the 45p tax rate.
That's the kind of government we are. We do respond when there are concerns and we act quickly.
And why do rail unions want to stop conference goers getting home by train tomorrow? Welcome to today's programme here in Birmingham with my guests. Let's start with a couple of newspaper headlines. In the Eye, first of all, Truss faces new Tory rebellion on benefit cuts. And this is the Telegraph's headline on the same story. Prime Minister takes on rebels to battle to rein in benefits. Sorry, we can't actually bring you the picture itself. But my first question to you all is, if Liz Truss decides not to increase or uprate benefits in line with inflation, does she have the authority to push it through, Pippa?
I think it's going to be a big problem for her because not only is there already unrest about this on the backbenches, Michael Gove was one of the first voices again coming out against the prospect of putting benefits up in line with earnings rather than inflation, but there are cabinet splits, really serious cabinet splits, including with some of the most senior members of the cabinet. And if she can't get it through her own cabinet, she's not going to get it through her own party. We
have the front page of the Telegraph, your paper. There it is. Prime Minister takes on rebels in battle to rein in benefits. Do you think she'll have the authority to push it through if she doesn't go ahead with uprating?
It's hard to tell because there's a debate going on as to whether the U-turn over the 45p tax rate was about the numbers having been crunched on a rebellion or just the optics, or maybe a combination of the two. I mean, Michael Gove obviously has sort of set out his stall this week and been a thorn in the government's side. You have to ask yourself, who does he actually represent? What's his caucus of support? Because he's kind of a lone ranger in the party. However, as you've just heard from Robert Halfron and Will here, there is discontent. I think Chloe Smith, you know, the Work and Pensions Secretary, won't exactly be in favour of a policy that, as she's just starting out in this fledgling position in a really big department, is going to prove unpopular with the public. But the Conservative argument will be, if workers' wages aren't going up in line with inflation, why should benefits?
Well, that is true. But, Brendan, would Liz Truss have the authority to actually push through a policy that didn't uprate or increase benefits in line with inflation?
I believe so, but I think part of this as well, it's not just about uprating it with inflation. The idea is that you need that safety net there. People need to be able to pay their bills and so on. So it's not just about the benefits. It's about actually the cost of living generally. Now, that's why we put the energy package we did in place. So £400 for everybody, but £1,200 if you're the most vulnerable with that. Now, if you look at the extra support that we've actually added on, and if you count that, then that's actually more than the uprating of benefits with inflation. So I think we've already put that in place. Right, so that does justify, really, not uprating it in line with inflation for those who claim benefits. Well, yeah, it's the wider package. So whatever decision's made, it's a little bit above my pay grade, I will be honest. But at the same time, you know, people want to be able to manage, and that's what we're looking at, whether that's a direct payment, whether that's something to do with the energy, whether that's uprating it by inflation, whatever that is. Yes. That's the substance. What about the politics? Does she actually have the authority when you look at what happened in terms of the U-turn over the 45p tax rate? I think so. I think if you justify it. Now, the 45 pence tax rate, I think a good economic case was made from that in the sense that we went from 50% down to 45.
Well, clearly not for a lot of your Tory MPs.
Well, the Treasury actually made more money from that. But the problem is, of course, it needs to be politically viable as well. People have spoke about timing with that. Was it an appropriate time for it? And you've got to bring people with you. And I think the Prime Minister and Chancellor realised that maybe now wasn't the time to be discussing that kind of thing. And it was pragmatic that they changed that. And we've had a much better mood at conference, as you probably noticed since then.
Well, you may have a job on your hands persuading Robert Halfon. I spoke to him earlier, the Tory MP, senior Tory MP and chair of the House of Commons Education Select Committee. Let's have a look. The government has failed to confirm that it will uprate, increase all benefits in line with inflation. Should they?
Well, if the last week, particularly the last couple of days, has shown anything, is that we need to be a compassionate Conservative government. We need to be a government that is putting social justice at its heart. And that's why we absolutely need to make sure that we increase benefits in line with inflation. It was promised by the previous Chancellor, it was promised by the previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and it's those on lowest earnings who are being hurt the most by the cost of living challenges that we face. So it's morally right for the government to do so.
Would it be immoral for the government to fail to uprate benefits in line with inflation? If they come back and say that we're going to do it by less than inflation?
I think it'd be wrong. I think we have to be a compassionate Conservative government. This is what the last few days have shown. There was real anguish from the public, from my constituents in Harlow, about the 45p rate, because they felt that it was wrong that millionaires were getting £50,000 off their tax bill while they are struggling to feed their families.
How worried are people when they don't know yet what is going to happen to their benefits until they know for sure what the government is actually going to do?
Of course, I mean, what do I tell a single parent in my constituency working, not sitting at home, working a few days a week, trying to do the best for their child, and they're worrying day and night, as it is, about how they're going to pay the bills, because it isn't just energy, and I welcome the intervention on energy bills, but food prices have gone up, for example, by a huge amount. That single parent is going to be absolutely worrying at night whether or not they're going to get a benefit rise in line with inflation, because they are really struggling.
If the government fails to uprate benefits in line with inflation, will you be able to vote for it?
I'd be very reluctant to vote to, in essence, cut benefits for the poorest people in my constituency of Harlow.
Doesn't sound like you would vote for it at all.
I'd be very, very reluctant to vote for such a measure. Obviously, I want to see what they come forward with, what proposals there are, and how the government responds to the cost of living, particularly in terms of helping the vulnerable. We've also got the additional problem of mortgage rates going up. So whichever way you look at it, people are struggling, and this government has to be a compassionate Conservative government with social justice at its heart.
First impressions of the government out of 10?
I welcome the energy intervention. I think that was incredibly important. I've been calling for that for a long, long time. And I think it's pretty mixed, and they mustn't make the mistakes over the past week. I'm glad they've U-turn. I think they've listened. They've got to listen to the public, but let's have a compassionate government that, as I say, puts social justice at its heart and believes in growing society as much as it does in growing the economy.
If you bump into Robert Halfon later on today here at the conference centre, what would you say to him?
Well, Rob makes a fair point, and it's about fairness, really. Now, there will be people who are just about managing, as Theresa May used to refer to, who are working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And I think their expectation is that when people can work, they should work, and there's a fairness element there. And there's a million jobs available, plus I've got a couple of local pubs who've had to close on Mondays because they can't find staff. And, of course, we want to help those people into work. But as Rob articulated very well, there are lots of people who don't fit into that category. The people who are struggling to get by, there are carers, there are people with disabilities, and we want to do the right thing by them as well and provide that extra support. Sometimes that's targeted, sometimes that will go on the benefits, so it's about the wider package.
I think it's quite important, though, to remind people that, of course, when you're talking about benefits uplift, that 40% of people on universal credit, which is the main benefit that's paid out, are actually working. So it's not like you're sort of comparing working population and the non-working population. Often many of those people who are working also have caring responsibilities as well. And the other thing is that while this would obviously make a difference, if it goes up in line with earnings, then we're talking about 5-6% increase. If we look up in line with inflation, we're looking at like 10-11% increase. So it's a substantial difference. But economists like the Resolution Foundation have done research which shows that obviously the disproportionate impact of inflation is on the worst off. So those people that aren't necessarily in work would feel that much more strongly than those perhaps that are. And that's why that targeted response, putting up in line with inflation, is why so many of your ministers, including in the cabinet, feel that it has, including Penny Mordaunt this morning and others privately, are telling us that it has to go up in line with inflation.
Well, people need to pay their bills, and of course, even putting it up in line with inflation doesn't go anywhere near covering what their energy bills would be.
But it would help, wouldn't it?
Well, every little helps, as I say, and I think whether we can help people into employment, or whether we can provide a package for people with energy, or whether it's operating benefits, that's an option. It's not been taken off the table particularly, but we want to help people to manage, and we want to be fair. And I think the fairness element of it, and showing we are a compassionate government as well, but we've also got to be responsible and fair to those who are in work who maybe don't get as much help.
Right. I mean, morally right is what Robert Halfon said. It would be morally right in order to justify saying we're a compassionate Conservative government to do what he is proposing, which is that uplift.
I know, but this kind of cakeism, we've got a situation where the government wants to be fiscally disciplined, but yet wants to keep everybody happy by throwing more money at people. Now, I get that. But this is what's been lacking this week is the politics and the political argument around all of this decision-making. Actually, you could probably appease, I take Pippa's point about actually people being on a universal credit are working. So if you say, oh, well, we're going to give people on benefits an inflation-linked rise, but we're not going to give that to full-time workers, they would then turn around to them and say, but you have got extraordinarily large tax cuts. We've just brought the basic rate down. But what's happening here is, with all of the furore over the 45p rate, we've lost the fact, and Labour and the left have owned this. Suddenly the Tories have become, the party of the rich and not of the poor, even though they've just given the general public £65 billion towards their energy bills. Yeah. Because of the bad politicking and the bad comms around this, that's been completely lost. People are hearing from their energy companies and saying, oh, good, I've got 400 quid off my bill. And I think they're thanking the energy companies for it. They're not thanking the government, because Penny Mordaunt says the comms had been a swear word. No, the comms have been non-existent. So none of these arguments are being made. Where's the narrative? Where's the alternative narrative to what we heard in Liverpool?
Brendan?
And I think this is a hangover from COVID as well. And you look at the amount of support that was given then. It's one of these. It's getting.
What about the communications? What about the narrative? You failed to make those arguments. So I just heard Pippa say you're the nasty party, and you're at risk of being labelled that. Despite
I wasn't calling them the nasty party.
No.
Say. It's just that's reputation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister's made this point about getting the argument over and getting the communication over, and the timing. The 45p policy was a prime example of that, and there was all this package of really good things that we've done. We'd say that 95% of what was proposed has actually still gone through there, and it was just the small amount of it, I think, that people were talking about at the start of conference, and that was really a distraction with the communication, which is right, and which is why they really wanted to move on from that as quick as they could.
Now, there are some benefits that will actually be increased in line with inflation. It's not all benefits, but universal credit, of course, is what we are talking about. I mean, there is a fairness line which Camilla mentioned a moment ago, and that is one where it rises in line with earnings. Why should people on benefits, let's take those who aren't working, get more than those who are actually in work?
Well, the point is precisely because those people are the worst off, and they're disproportionately hit by they have much less space and they're in their household budgets, much less room in their household budgets to cope with the rising cost of living. So if the government's approach is protecting the most vulnerable, they're the most vulnerable, they're less resilient in terms of coping with the rising cost of living than somebody who would be working. And often, if they're not working and they're on benefits, it's because they've got all sorts of other issues, disabilities and so on. And so the argument is that they are the ones that need the extra support.
Also, the cost of living crisis has recontextualised these arguments, because you can make an argument about, workers' wages, in inverted commas, versus people on benefits, But because of the scenario we're in this kind of like unprecedented situation of hardship, where even the just about managings, or frankly, the better offs, you know, the people who are earning good money but aren't really seeing that they're earning good money because it's all having to be splurged on energy bills and increased costs of food and increased costs to run the car. You're then in this unique environment where the arguments that the Conservatives make just can't land as easily because most people would be a bit more sort of Corbynomically leaning because they understand how tough it is for people who are less well off.
Well, I mean, it isn't just backbenchers. People like Robert Halfon talking about this issue. You mentioned Penny Mordaunt, Leader of the House. Let's have a listen to what she said on Times Radio.
We're not about, trying to help people with one hand and take it away with another. But we do need to look at these, just like households and businesses are facing these cost challenges, so are governments, departments and the services that they run. But all that needs to be looked at. It will be brought forward in the proper way.
Do you think that benefits should rise in line with inflation?
I have always supported, whether it's pensions, whether it's our welfare system, keeping pace with inflation. It makes sense to do so. So that's what I voted for before, and so have a lot of my colleagues.
Penny Mordaunt's made up her mind, and she's right. It's something that was actually going to be introduced under Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. They pledged to do it. Why can't you make up your mind?
Well, I think pensions have been mentioned there. I think pensions are very different.
Why? Why are they different? I mean, they're going ahead with the triple lot, which means it will rise with inflation.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about people who've worked, people who've retired. They're not benefits in the traditional sense, I would say, with pensions. But, I mean, that's something that we'd long pledged. But what I also say is we've adapted to the situation. Just putting a rise on benefits is not enough to pay energy bills, as we said. So we have to look at very targeted support. We have to make sure that it's going into the right place. But, of course, it's not been taken off the table yet. An announcement hasn't actually been made.
Did she really talk too soon, Penny Mordaunt, then?
Well, again, there's a variety of ways of doing this. Penny's given her opinion on what she thinks.
But should she have waited,
generally,
since we are waiting for the government to make a decision?
Well, I mean, she thinks that's one way of solving it, as a suggestion. The announcement hasn't been made yet. I'm looking at targeted ways of doing it. I'm not opposed one way or another to whether you raise it or not, but I'm looking at the bigger picture of how are you supporting people the best. If Penny thinks that the best way of doing it is, then, of course, it's a conference. We want to encourage discussion as well. But also,
Yeah, but the trouble is, why these debates are going on and why Gove is, making merry hell as ever, running around conference at fringe events voicing his opinions, is that there's now a chink in the armour. The lady who wasn't for turning has turned. She's turned at the first opportunity. Regardless of whether you agree with that ideologically or not, that has just let these rebels in. That has said, oh, hang on a minute. If she's turning on this, what else will she turn on? I don't like fracking. I'm going to rebel against that. I don't like the benefits changes. And then you have to ask yourself, oh, what? So she's not going to get any of these supply-side reforms through. What's then the point of her? That's the trouble.
Well, the Tory rebels are obviously emboldened by this, and to have a cabinet minister come out quite clearly, unilaterally, coming out and expressing her view and opinion, which actually some of her colleagues may share, is really difficult. Now, there's not necessarily going to be a vote on specifically on benefits up rating. It can go through a statutory instrument, so it may not be a case of sort of a crunch commons moment. But nevertheless, if the Prime Minister presses ahead with it when she doesn't have the support of a cabinet and her party, or indeed the public, it's really potentially very tricky. And it's not, you mentioned the lady not for turning. I mean, this is obviously the 45p was the first big U-turn. We also saw one with bringing forward the date of the mini budget, the medium-term fiscal event,
next
or whatever we're supposed to call it.
Yes.
And she's also done it previously with the cap on energy bills. So she's not looking actually as though she's able to ram through on some of her promises. And the rebels will be absolutely picking up on that.
Well, let's continue in that vein, Camilla, because that is the front page headline on the Daily Mail, is get a grip. On the basis of what Pippa has just outlined, can she get a grip? How does she do it?
I mean, the Daily Mail is angry, as are a lot of the friendlies, because, 1 minute we're writing leaders going, the lady's not for turning, and the very next morning she's turned. So that explains the reaction of the right-wing press this morning, who are pretty cross. You know, the politics hasn't been good. The sequencing has been terrible, as Brendan has admitted. You know, this idea that you rush out a raft of tax cuts and overshadow your own multi-billion-pound bailout is idiotic. 1922 boss Sir Graham Brady, I see that tweet there from Harry Cole.
That's Harry Cole in The Sun, which is what Camilla's referring to. 1922 boss, that's the chair of the backbench committee of Conservative MPs. Sir Graham Brady went to see the Prime Minister at 7 o'clock on Sunday to warn her 45p tax could bring her down as she didn't have the votes in Parliament.
I know, but this is about sort of sticking to one's guns or not, really, isn't it? I mean, you've got to have an enormous amount of courage in politics. If you're going to nail your colours to the mast, you know, she needs to... I would say there's quite a lot riding on this speech tomorrow. You know, she has positioned herself as the heir to Thatcher. That's problematic because who can fill those shoes? And we're living in very different times. And we're living in a multimedia age, by the way, where, like, you know, things can spiral into crises within 2 minutes on Twitter. You know, this is the other problem that she's facing. But I think there's an expectation that there needs to be a grip. And there's also a little bit of concern, a bit like in the Johnson era, you know, are there enough grown-ups around the table, you know, giving the advice?
Are there enough grown-ups around the table? Is she going to just turn on all her other policies, or at least some of them?
Well, the grown-up thing to do, I think, is to support the Prime Minister. We had a very long, drawn-out leadership contest. It was a month. We had these debates. A lot of these things were announced in advance. I think there was ample opportunity to actually get the opinion across there. But I think at the end of the day, once the Prime Minister's in place, you need to support them and you need to move forward. Because if we don't do that as a party, that's where we got in the situation with Boris Johnson, of course, in Parliament. And it's about MPs coming together, supporting a programme. That's the only way we're going to grow.
Well, as long as that programme stays the same, I suppose, which is what Pippa and Camilla are saying, because actually the latest U-turn that, Pippa, you were talking about is the Chancellor bringing forward the date he'll go to the Commons to explain how he's going to pay for his tax cuts. I spoke to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Chris Philp, about exactly that yesterday.
It's a plan. It's got specific measures, specific steps that will deliver this growth. You asked about the OBR forecast. You won't have long to wait. On the 23rd...
end of November.
Well, look, we've got to make sure that it's scored properly. We've got to make sure all of our policies on the supply side, so reducing regulations, are fully laid out so the OBR can take them into consideration. We've also, of course, got to set out the medium-term fiscal plan, that responsible approach we're going to take to reducing the ratio of debt to GDP. All of that will come together on the 23rd of November.
Right, well, that was the 23rd of November. We now know it's going to be possibly as soon as next week. I think there is a headline in the FT. While we wait for that to come up, I mean, how many U-turns are there going to be?
Well, I think it's important to adapt to the markets. And, of course, we've had a look what's been happening with that. People have been asking the Chancellor to do this. He has said he would speak to the OBR. It's about being pragmatic as well. And I think the Chancellor is on the 45p tax, has listened to people, he's listened to colleagues, listened to what people have said about the OBR as well, and he's trying to bring that forward, and he wants to show that actually the plan that he has is a sound one.
Right. I mean, whether it's ready or not, you listened to Chris Philp, who said, no, it's still, you know, work in progress, and now they're going to be able to rush it out. The headline in the Financial Times says Kwasi Kwarteng to bring forward debt-cutting plan after tax U-turn. Now, he did say in his speech tomorrow, we'll be bringing it forward shortly, and I presume that was still the 23rd of November. Now it looks as if it is coming forward.
At least a month earlier.
At least a month earlier. I mean, what do you make of it?
Well, because I think the prevarication in between is going to scare the markets, perhaps, but also just annoy everybody in the party and indeed the electorate, perhaps. However, you know, my view on the 45p thing was the damage was already done. You know, it was unpopular, but, you know, sometimes you have to make unpopular decisions. If she was going to be Thatcherite about it, she'd just gone, well, yeah, some of you won't agree with me, but this is how I grow the pie. She's talking about growing this pie, this growth pie, and this is one of the measures we've done. And you might not like it, but we're going to create wealth. And we do believe in trickle-down, even if the left don't. We think they're wrong. We think that Keir Starmer actually isn't going to, you know, we think that interest rates will go up under Keir Starmer. You won't just lose your house, you'll lose your job. There's no attack lines coming from the Conservatives at the moment. It's strange.
But you need authority to do that.
Yeah, and she's definitely lost that. And I think even by proposing, and take 45p tax rate, even by proposing that and then rowing back on it, the damage is already done there. It already has sort of like set in train this narrative that the Conservatives are the party of the rich. They're prepared to, you know, cut taxes, bankers' bonuses for their wealthy friends, while sort of penalising financially those at the bottom. That's a really difficult place for the Conservative Party to be in, particularly when you consider and you'll know a lot about this, this actually quite a fragile coalition that Boris Johnson built in 2019, bringing in lots of red wall seats.
We're going to talk
These
about
were
that.
former Labour voters who lent their votes to the Conservatives for the first time. And what's going to be really interesting to see is whether those voters feel that now, with this sort of new narrative that's emerged, that they're going to be able to back the Conservatives going forward. 2 years or 18 months, or whenever the next election is a long time away. We all know that life comes at you fast, politics comes at you faster at the moment, so it could still be turned around, but things are not looking great at the moment.
And of course, markets like certainty, and this is one of the things, for the 45p tax, it's not something that had been discussed so much before, maybe took it as a bit of a surprise.
Hadn't been discussed with the Cabinet
but of
at all,
course,
it seems.
and since that's been rolled back, if you look at the pound today against the dollar, it's the strongest it's been for a couple of weeks now, and what the Chancellor's trying to do, and certainly if he brings this forward, is give that more certainty to the markets, and I think that's the direction we're looking at taking now.
Was there a problem with judgment then, in terms of rushing all that stuff out on the 23rd of September?
Well, I think, as we said, over the summer, it was such a long, drawn-out leadership contest. We've then had a mourning period nationally, and it's very difficult for a new administration that's actually coming in and wanting to get those announcements out. People are wanting action, people wanting things done, and it was trying to get a lot of those things out. So I can see why, at the same time, looking at it from your communications point of view, you would perhaps get some of the more popular things out first. But I can understand why, really, the government's very keen to crack on. People wanted us to crack on, but the side effect to that is, sometimes it's a lot of announcements in one go.
How are you explaining this to your constituents, though? How are you explaining broadly what we would call Trussonomics?
Yeah, I mean, people want growth. I mean, they want pride in their area, obviously. They want to have a good job. They want to be able to pay their mortgage. They want to see their energy bills coming down and all of these things. And we're explaining that we're going to do this through growth. We've set out we want to tackle everything. And at the end of the day, families, they will look at their bank balance at the end of the month. They will look at their cost of living. They'll look at whether their lot is better or not. And when Boris Johnson came in, that was one of the policies. It's about making people's lives better, not just throwing money at it, but generally being positive. And the current Prime Minister as well wants to do exactly the same thing.
Well,
she thinks you do that through growth and growing the pie, as she would say.
Well, I spoke to Matt Goodwin yesterday, whom you'll know, Professor of Politics at Kent University. He's also something of an expert about the seats like yours, the sort of red wall seats, those occupied by Labour for decades and taken or lent, as Pippa said, their votes to you in 2019. This is what he had to say.
If the Conservatives go into the next general election promising tax cuts alongside cuts to public spending, they will be completely wiped out. That position is supported by 6% of the country. Most voters, especially working class voters, do not want to live in an economy where taxes are being lowered and the state is being shrunk at the same time. I can't explain to you, Joe, how toxic that is for most voters. It's just not where they are.
Brendan?
Well, you look at the money we've put in the NHS more than ever before. What people want are effective public services. And I take Matt's point there, of course, ideally people want both. They want low taxes and they want great public services as well. And you have to find a combination. Now, a lot of these voters, we spoke about culture wars and so on, and a lot of very culturally conservative people. For example, one of the biggest issues I tend to get is about the small boats and immigration and so on. And that's still a very live issue in the Red Wall, I would say. But again, it's the standard of living, and people are looking for normality. Now, you could say in terms of after having austerity, after having what's happened with COVID, you've got to go back quite a long way, I suppose, until we really had what was normal. People have forgot what normal is, and people are quite understandably, they worry about that. People do worry about what's going to happen.
But I think the question here is the offer from this government that might be worrying people. I mean, that was a pretty stark statistic there from Matt Goodwin. I mean, he said, the position of promising tax cuts alongside cuts to public spending, which are expected now when you look at the figures over the next 2 years, you'd be wiped out.
People perhaps see tax cuts as quite esoteric, whereas they really are focused on, for instance, the interest rate, because they know what they're paying. Sometimes it's difficult to keep track of, what am I being taxed and where, and the levy and all the rest of it, whereas people do really understand what they're paying in their mortgage every month, particularly if it goes up exponentially. There's also been a confusion between, Trussonomics being Thatcher economics or Reaganomics. Ronald Reagan famously said about the deficit, aren't you worried about how big the deficit is? Oh, the deficit's big enough to look after itself. Thatcher was very much about low tax, but also fiscal discipline. So where does she sit in all that? The sad thing about it is actually Liz Truss is a radical. She's got clarity of ideological thinking, but the voters must be really confused. What is this party doing? Is it sticking to its guns, and is it trying to grow the pie by creating wealth in a traditional sort of conservative manner? Now it's done this U-turn. It's like, oh, is it actually into sort of, you know, Robert Halfron-esque sort of Corbynomics? Maybe it's reflective of the fact, and maybe Matt Goodwin there is reflecting the fact that actually people are quite socially conservative, but increasingly economically left-wing because of furlough and because of this idea that the world has changed. I don't know, Pippa.
Well, I think Brendan's point is really interesting, that we've had this spell where we've had the pandemic, we've had Brexit, we've had all this sort of political upheaval in people's lives over the last 5 or 6 years. And actually, I think what a lot of your viewers will be thinking is, politicians, get out my life, you know, make my life better. But I'm fed up with the psychodrama of Westminster. And lo and behold, here we are again, another Tory psychodrama. And people are just, you know, I think that's a problem for all politics. It's not just left, it's not like a particularly Tory thing. But when the focus seems to be what's going on at Westminster rather than what's going on in people's lives, as is increasingly becoming the case with these rows over things right now, and I know it's all intensified because we're in party conference season, then it turns people off politics even more. And I think that they're in a position where, you know, they're looking at what's on offer, they're comparing what's being said on programmes like this amongst politicians and commentators with what's going on in their lives. They just want a period of stability. And the one thing that doesn't look like that the new Truss government is doing right now is offering that stability.
Brendan?
Well, I think this is the key thing, isn't it? And what made me a Conservative, it's a belief in, you know, the individual, their family, and that liberty side of it, and the state kind of butting out. But you want the state to create the conditions where you can thrive in life. And I think, as Pippa's saying, you know, families will look at their budgets and they want that normality. I could go back to when I bought my first house. It was, you know, just before the financial crisis, and I thought how wonderful it was to have a 5% interest rate at the time. It was the lowest in my lifetime, and then it crashed.
On that point of Matt Goodwin's research there, if it's really saying, so people don't want lower taxes and a smaller state, ergo they want higher taxes and a bigger state, that then means you've lost the economic argument. You know, why are people saying, oh, I'd love to be taxed more? That's because the Conservatives aren't providing a clear alternative view. That must be worrying to you. It must be worrying to hear that people actually want to be taxed more. They're kind of, you know, Jeremy Corbyn economics and politics.
People want things to work, and I think in terms of tax, and this is the key ideological argument in a way, and that we've always said that actually with lower taxes you generate more growth and therefore more income. And I think that's the argument that we're making about growth, is that low taxes actually do benefit us.
Yeah, but if you listen, as Camilla was saying, just to repeat that, he's saying that's not what people in your constituency voted for in 2019. Maybe they were more culturally conservative, but economically left-wing. Boris Johnson was seen as bigger state. And what they don't want, or they are prepared to do, is pay a little bit more tax and have stronger public services. This government is talking a different language. Under Kwasi Kwarteng yesterday, he said very clearly, rightly or wrongly, I want to do conservative things. I want people to keep more of their own money, more of the money that they earn. But maybe that's just not going to work. Are you worried about your seat?
Well, it's about levelling up as well. It's not just about big, shiny buildings everywhere and new town centres. It's about giving people a better standard of living, better jobs, that they can work in their own communities, and that positive vision. So I do actually think there is a place for it. I do think that we're actually going to get there and show those places that we're actually delivering what we said we're going to. But at the same time, it's up to us to make that argument, and that, of course, is going to be the challenge over the next 2 years.
Well, you mentioned immigration earlier on in the discussion. Kwasi Kwarteng said, when we talk about these supply-side reforms, that he wants government to get out of the way. What are the barriers you want to remove from immigration?
Well, I think with immigration, I mean, nobody's saying all immigration is bad. You know, we want people with skills. Yeah. We want people who are going to come and work in our NHS, or people who are working in IT, or in other things.
So what do you want to change, then?
Well, that's the thing. We want to make it easier for people that are going to benefit our economy, but we also want to be very clear with people who are abusing the system, and it's going back to fairness again. So, you know, in the Red Wall, even with areas with very low bits, low immigration, they see it as unfair, and it's this fairness argument. Again, the 45p tax.
Yeah, but
however
what is it? But what is it you want to see taken away? What are the obstacles that are preventing you? Well, let's take the figure broadly: net migration, 250,000. Should it be higher or lower? And if it should be lower, how are you going to do it?
And it's how you categorise it. Are we talking about students? Are we talking about what's happening in Dover and places like that? I mean, people are getting angry at the unskilled side of it and people cheating the system. And they look at Brexit, it was all about taking back control of the immigration system. You look at what the Home Secretary said now about people who want to cheat our system. You know, you will not be allowed to stay in this country.
But they're happy, your constituents, with more high-skilled immigration.
Well, I think, first of all, they'd want those people to be trained in the UK, actually, and they want to see British people, obviously, moving into these jobs. But, of course, internationally, you know, we want people with these skills to come to this country. And I don't think the argument is against all immigration, but it's got to be actually structured and targeted, which ones we're having.
But how does, and how do Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng make that argument on taking government out of certain areas, be it childcare, immigration, whatever really that, you know, they want to do in terms of business, to constituents like Brendan's in those areas?
But then Brendan's highlighted, and as has Matt Goodwin's research actually, this difficult job that the Tory has of trying to keep two very, very different bodies of people happy. The red, you know, you were talking about low tax. It doesn't appeal necessarily in the red wall, but it probably does down in the Tory shires.
So do you think they can pull it off again, the Conservative?
But this is also the Boris Johnson factor that needs to be considered here, because there is, whether Brendan knows it or likes it, talk of, you know, Cincinnatus, some sort of Boris comeback, because
he'd like that.
He'd like that. But the point is,
would like that.
why did he manage to... If you're going to try and unite these extraordinary different caucuses of people in Great Britain, then you need a unifying big character, and you need a sort of overall vision, and you need to be able to articulate it very carefully. And that's perhaps what's missing here.
Pippa, I'm going to ask you, we're going to move on to something else. How are you getting home tomorrow?
Because it's a train strike.
That's right.
From Birmingham to London. And actually, the Guardian's hired a minibus for those of us that are up
Is there
here.
any room? Is there any room on the minibus?
There might be. Do you need a lift?
No, I think I'm all right.
I brought my Mini Cooper. I'll give you a lift back, if you like, tomorrow.
Oh, look at all these offers to go home tomorrow. How are you getting home?
I got a lift, thankfully. I'm very lucky with that as well.
What is your reaction to the strikes?
It's very disappointing, really. I mean, I think, you know, I appreciate people's right to strike, and people obviously want to argue for a better, fairer wage. And, of course, as a union, it's your job to do that. I respect that and I fully understand that. But I think, again, you've got to bring people with you. Do people feel this is reasonable? I don't think they do. And that's why we're looking at taking steps, really, providing things such as minimum services. Now, we're not talking about some big multinational company making huge profits and not paying their workers properly. We're talking about a very important public service. They're very high fares in some cases, and it's going to be passed on to the passengers, of course, if they get their own way.
Well, let's talk to Frances O'Grady, General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress. I think she can join us now. Hopefully you heard those arguments being laid out. What do you make of them?
Well, I think the government is planning an attack on what is a fundamental British liberty, and that is the right to withdraw your labour. Now, we know that most people certainly don't want to have to take that difficult decision to vote for strike action, and that when they do, it's because the employer won't listen or won't compromise. But we are facing in this country a massive cost of living crisis, that it is a wage crisis. And people aren't even striking for a pay rise. They're striking to defend the wages that they have from being cut. We did have Grant Shapps on rail. His kind of particular macho behaviour, I think, was not helpful in terms of trying to find a settlement, because that's what we want to do. And I know that the unions have met Anne-Marie Trevelyan. Let's hope that instead of stopping the employers coming to a deal with unions, let's hope Anne-Marie Trevelyan encourages them to do so.
Brendan?
Well, the Secretary of State is trying, as Frances has pointed out. Yeah, we want to have a positive dialogue with unions, and we want to make sure that we can come to a deal that people find fair from all parties. But at the same time, you know, we have to be realistic, same as any other business.
There was a report in the FT today that Jacob Rees-Mogg is planning to attack workers' rights more broadly, rights to maximum working hours, to paid holidays and rest breaks, and protection against unfair dismissal. Can you confirm or deny those reports?
Brendan?
Well, certainly we're committed to protecting workers' rights. I think we have some of the best rights in the world in this country, and I think at times we take that for granted. But what I'd also say is, again, people expect basic things. Now, a lot of members, are they balloted? Are they actually asked about some of these pay rises? In some cases, they haven't been. So I think it's very important that actually the members of a lot of these unions have a say, because a lot of the time they don't get that, Francis.
I think, Brendan, the problem is that the government is attacking the symptoms rather than the cause. You take a nurse, she is now on average, or he is on average, £4,000 worse off in real terms compared to 10 years ago. They're facing a £1,000 real pay cut. Now, these were the people that government ministers came out on the doorstep to clap. They're now preparing to clobber their pay packets with these unfunded tax cuts, lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses at the same time as driving down nurses' pay, and firefighters and prison officers and rail workers and many others. Is that the right thing to do?
Well, I think if the government wasn't spending some money in areas that are unnecessary, then more of that money could go towards pay, it could go towards reducing ticket prices. And you look at some of the very ineffective working practices. Grant Shapps did highlight that when he was Transport Secretary. There's the argument over ticket officers.
Who won't confirm that she trusts her own Chancellor. If she doesn't trust him, how can the rest of us? This government, within a few weeks, has taken us to the brink of disaster. Working people are really struggling. I'm speaking to workers who are sending their kids to school in shoes that have big holes in because they can't afford to replace them. When is the government going to get a grip and actually put working families at the centre of its strategy for fair growth rather than just lining the pockets of bankers in the city?
Brendan?
And of course, that's what we're doing. We wanted to see wage growth. As a Brexiteer, as I said, that was one of the big reasons that we did that. But we've introduced tax cuts. We want families to keep more of that money. We've given 30 million people a tax cut across the board. We rolled back that national insurance increase. We've given £400 to every household in the country for their energy bills, and even up to £1,200 in some cases. So we are putting.
Hang on, Francis. Hang on, Francis. Let him finish his sentence. All right.
Francis, if we don't get that growth, and if we don't reform services which are not spending money effectively, then we're not going to be able to pay those kind of wages. And this is what the reforms are all about.
Francis?
Don't you think that the likes of Amazon and many others should be paying their fair whack, and instead you cancelled the increase in corporation tax that frankly would have helped our public services get off their knees? And they're important to wealth creation and growth too, because if we haven't got a healthy workforce, if they're not trained and educated, if they can't get to work and if they can't access broadband, then we're all in big trouble. So it's about time, I think, that the government started seeing workers as wealth creators rather than just being on the side of big business and the rich.
Francis O'Grady, thank you. Who's winning this discussion and debate?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think this wave of strikes that we've seen, obviously rail recently and on Wednesday, but we've also had the prospect of strike action proposed, as Francis mentioned, in the health service, in schools, right across the public sector this winter. You can imagine a time where that would be met with a very different response from the public, but because the public, people, as Camilla was saying earlier, have actually quite generous means themselves, fairly well off themselves, are feeling the pinch. There's a real sort of understanding, I think, that this is that everybody's in a really difficult position, and there's a sort of like a sympathy almost that public sector workers, who are amongst some of the lowest paid, want to get a pay deal, a good pay deal, not just so that they can splash it all on extra holidays or whatever, but so that they can live.
I think there's a sympathy with the cause, but perhaps not the method. I think quite a lot of people think that the rail unions particularly use strike as a first resort rather than last. You know, we're all for workers, but what about the workers who want to get to work? You know, there is this kind of, ultra-militant tendency among the Mick Lynches of this world. Some of the public look on and go, I think this is perhaps using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I like the description of Grant Shapps as macho.
Yeah, macho behaviour.
Wow, and that's probably the first time that's ever been used about the former Transport Secretary.
Well, briefly, on that note, just hold that thought. Tomorrow, the big speech. Liz Truss, I think it's 10:30. The speech actually... Oh, so we're on air at 10:30. Let me correct that now. Her speech is at 11. I think it's just changed, actually, this morning. Obviously, we'll be covering it live on Politics Live. Please join us, me and my guests. What does she have to do?
I think there's two things. As ever with these speeches, she has to talk to the people in the room, not least because she'll have a lot of members that backed her that are feeling quite jittery about what's gone on in the last few days, and the Tory MPs, those Tory MPs that are here, because of course many have stayed away, to try and solidify her support back at Westminster. But more importantly, she needs to go beyond that and speak to the country.
Camilla, briefly.
Yeah, explain the ideology, justify the decision-making, and say that Keir Starmer isn't the next Messiah, is just the same as the rest of Labour.
Well, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Brendan, for joining us, and all of our guests. That's all for today. I will be back, as I said, tomorrow at 10:30 with Politics Live for the Prime Minister's Speech to Conference on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.